right, well, welcome everyone to another meeting of the Task Force on Reimagining Public Safety in the City of Richmond. Appreciate everyone hopping on again on a Friday. Today, we are going to cover a number of items. So we're going to go through our agenda really quickly. It'll be welcome and updates from myself. And then we'll do a public safety, definition of public safety exercise that Daryl will help us run through. And then Carol is going to lead us through some ideas related to community engagement and getting feedback on our initial recommendations. And then we're going to have the co-chairs of the subgroups just kind of quickly run through some of their discussion on next steps that they've had this week. So that we can all just kind of learn from each other about where we're headed next in terms of recommendations and next steps. And so we might have to rearrange the agenda a little bit because I'm waiting. I think I'm still waiting for Daryl to hop on. So as soon as he does, we can get on that topic. But just to run through some of the updates that we have for you this week. So as you all are aware, part of the task force on reimagining public safety was aligned with the Obama Foundation's Obama pledge to reviewing use of force policies and taking a look at how use of force is implemented in various communities. And so what I have done as part of that pledge that the mayor signed on to is I've sent them a copy of the initial report, just letting them know kind of where we are in the process, knowing that these are initial recommendations to them. And so they are in receipt of that initial report. And we sent them kind of a high level summary, stating the timeline of the task force and the work of the task force. And so they may or may not issue anything on what Richmond is doing. I'm not sure. We know they are in receipt of that document, but I'm not sure how they're planning on talking about it in the future. So, but just wanted to thank you all for your collaboration in getting that initial report, and we will continue to work on our final recommendations going forward. But I wanted to let you all know that I did follow up with the Obama Foundation as part of our discussion early on. Also this week, I had a meeting with all of the co-chairs and just wanted to circle everyone up. We had a conversation coming out of the meeting with Mayor Stoney and Chief Smith last week, and wanting to have some more specific feedback from the administration on the initial recommendations. And so we're going to be working to make sure that you get the feedback that'll be most helpful to all in your subgroups to continue to flesh out your initial recommendations, or just help you prioritize your initial recommendations. And so we're working to make sure that the appropriate folks attend your meetings so that they can provide any feedback or help answer any questions. So we'll make sure that those collaborative conversations are happening and continue to happen moving forward, so that you all can ask specific questions and get into kind of nitty-gritty details about some of your initial recommendations. I think the other thing that we talked about in that meeting was just the need to prioritize your initial recommendations moving forward, and to separate them into short and long-term avenues and timelines going forward as well, just to help the administration understand what your priorities are in the short and the long term as well. So I think coming up with similar kind of timelines to that effect would be really, really helpful as part of your next steps in your subgroups. So those are some of the updates that I had for folks. Does anybody have any questions about anything that I provided an update on? All right, seeing none there. Daryl, are you on yet? Doesn't look like Daryl is on yet, so I'm gonna just keep pushing his item down until he's able to hop on. So Carol, could I turn it over to you to talk a little bit about community engagement?
Yes, Maggie. Good evening, everybody. As a full body, we've been working through this framework of reimagining public safety, and we've discussed on numerous occasions as a full body and in our subcommittee meetings, the importance of the community voices. We've shared our initial recommendations with the mayor, the chief of police, and the community at large. So, however, now it's important that we seek input from the community members within the four quadrants of our city. And this week, as Maggie talked about, when we had our co-chairs meeting, we discussed initiating listening sessions as soon as possible. So we're halfway through now. So we wanted to share with everyone that we have scheduled our first listening session with RRHA Resident Tenant Organization for Monday, October the 5th, 2020 at 5 p.m. And this is just the first of however many that we will be able to have. But as we move forward, we would like for each committee member to consider other groups for participation as we proceed towards our final recommendations. And so right now, we sat with at the table with the chief and the mayor to get input from them. So now we need the citizens to weigh in and to just share with us what they think about our recommendations, and just to be like a guiding point as to if we are headed in the right direction as we complete this work, that's going to impact them and represent them. And so just take some time to think about any groups that you think that would be good. And we wanted to do it in all four sectors of the city so that we can make sure that it is diverse and well represented of the voices from within our communities.
And to add on to that, we're thinking of forming it as structured listening sessions, so that it's not quite a focus group, but it's not quite as open-ended as just a listening session. So it'd have some specific questions related to the recommendations that we want to get folks' feedback on. And as Carol said, we wanted to make sure that we touch on all the quadrants around the city to get input. And so I think we're still working through the details on, exactly how we go about that and making sure that we follow COVID protocols and all of that. So we're still working through that, but would love any of y'all's input or thoughts on how we go about, making sure that we get genuine, authentic community input on these initial recommendations moving forward. So I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts on that.
This is a quiet Friday.
I know. All right, well, seeing none right now, we will continue to move forward, and obviously I'm going to keep everyone up to date per usual in your subgroup meetings as we continue to flesh out that structure and the timeline for that engagement. But really hope, obviously, knowing that we are, going into the next 45 days of work, we'll need to do that as soon as possible. So we'll be working to get that off the ground very quickly. So please let me know. Feel free to reach out if you have any thoughts or want to help us with that effort. I know the co-chairs have said that they would like to, continue to be involved in those conversations. So please let me know if anyone else would like to join as well. We'll most likely be doing these in person just so that we can have those, face-to-face conversations as well, but, while maintaining social distance. So I'll keep everyone up to date on that. I don't think Daryl has joined yet, so I'm going to go to our next item then, is just report outs from the subgroup co-chairs, just about kind of what they're thinking for next steps, knowing that everybody has seen the full compiled initial report. And so, just what you're thinking in terms of next steps, what things that you think we still need to consider moving forward, or how you're planning to structure your meetings, just so that everyone can garner ideas from each other and just kind of hear what next steps are. So Tori, could we start with you?
Yes. Sorry, I was just trying to reach Daryl and make sure he was okay, but I wasn't able to reach him. Our group, realizing that a lot of our recommendations fall under the work that may happen out the Human Service Office. So we met with someone out of their office, and Wednesday, they gave us a presentation of some work that they had already started. So our next step would be to work very closely with the um, Office of the Human Services and Department of Social Services around some of the work that they're doing and how do we incorporate some of our recommendations into that so that those recommendations can get implemented sooner than later. We will also go out into some of the community meetings, um, mainly with the Richmond tenant organizations and others, to make sure that what's being recommended cover any issues and concerns they may have. And if we miss anything, we want to be sure to get that and include it in the work. So that's where we're at this point.
Thank you, Tori. Does anybody else have any, questions for Tori or on where they're going, or any questions about the initial recommendations in the report? Comments, suggestions? Quite quiet today. Is everybody just completely zoomed out? Will says no.
Hey, Maggie, this is Birdie. My
Hey, Birdie.
internet, even with the picture off, is going in and out. So I just called in. If you see a strange number on there, I just called in. So I don't know whether I should just operate by phone because it keeps freezing you all.
Okay, thank you, Birdie. I appreciate it.
Okay, all right.
All right, so Ram and Birdie, can we go over to you for community engagement updates, kind of what you all are thinking for next steps?
Birdie, you want to go? Or you want me to start off?
Okay, I'm gonna try. I'm on the computer now. I don't know what is wrong with my internet, but anyway, yes, we basically presented our recommendations, and there were quite a few. Our next step is to deep dive into the listening sessions in the community. So we're going to hopefully set some of those so that we can get some feedback from the community in reference to the recommendations that we made. And we also are going to have some presentations to the subcommittee to also get more information. One of the things that we really talked about was having a center for reconciliation or for racial healing or something along that lines. And so we wanted to see what the feasibility was going to be to actually put it into maybe something that the city is already doing, or, set up a center for reconciliation so that some of the suggestions that we had would have a person who actually could help to facilitate the ideas and the different things that we were talking about. Also, we're really excited about the topic of massive resilience. And so we want to, take that a step further so that we can get some excitement in reference to just bouncing back and really healing the community and bringing some good things that will change some of the systems.
Thanks, Birdie. Ram, do you have, or anyone else have anything to add?
I would just add, to piggyback off what Birdie said, this idea that we imagined or we're envisioning about creating a Center for Racial Justice and Conciliation. After our last conversation, we, like she said, realized it would be really helpful, not so much realize, but consider next steps to get some presentations and insight from like members of the Office for Community Wealth Building, because perhaps this might turn out to be like an Office of Restorative Justice focused on healing community relationships. And then we definitely want to have inclusive listening sessions where people who might not normally give their feedback to a process like that will be encouraged, contacted, invited, and welcome to respond to our recommendations as a subcommittee and the task force as a whole. And then we're also looking at how next steps might focus on agencies or organizational, agencies around the city, like the police department, city government, city council, the public schools, coming together to see how these recommendations can be supported, developed, enhanced through an interorganizational collaboration, like maybe something that can feed into the hubs that the Richmond Public Schools are implementing and pushing out into all of the different areas of the city, the 4 major areas of the city. And like Birdie said too, we're excited about this idea of creating these training opportunities to empower community members to build collectively and in the spirit of massive resilience. So it's kind of like piggybacking off of what she said and just putting out the idea that this community engagement and community healing is an effort to work with all neighborhoods, all communities. One of the things that came up too is the idea of how do we address root causes like poverty, like where do our recommendations fit in with the vision of eradicating poverty in the city. So a lot of deep conversations about deeply rooted issues, but there's a lot of hope and enthusiasm too, and hope in the sense of something that's honest, opportunity for progress to emerge. So we're excited about the work that still lies ahead of us, and we're confident that our recommendations are going to reflect a positive vision.
Thank you so much, Ram and Birdie, for those updates. Does anybody have any questions, comments, suggestions for this subgroup? I'm seeing a trend, everyone. No, I appreciate you all being here. So let's see, Sheba and Natasha, Courtney, do you all want to provide kind of updates on what you all are thinking for next steps, knowing that we're halfway?
So our past meeting, we discussed the report itself and where to kind of go from there. We talked about some past situations with RPD that didn't get resolved. We talked about leadership having some support and training, and accountability. Accountability is always like number one on our list. And we were also discussing with the group, because everybody wasn't at the meeting with the chief and the mayor, just the recommendations and how everybody felt about them and where we go from there. So we did not kind of devolve into next steps. We will continue our weekly meetings because use of force doesn't really change. You know, we want to see better representation for people who feel they are harmed, even if it doesn't result in a favorable outcome. At the very least, we want it addressed in a better manner than what we're seeing now. We also talked about policy and how we can push, not push forward, but like move forward with making some changes. We definitely addressed the anonymous call process and maybe how that will work out. And I think we were looking for we got homework from the chief, so we were told to look back at some of the policies that Richmond has in place now. But again, like as we have been addressing from the beginning, there's policy and there's practice, and we want to kind of dive into where's the breakdown in practice if we have these amazing policies on file. Um, Courtney and Natasha, I'm not sure if you all have anything to add, or anybody from our group.
I think you covered it pretty well. I think the frustration is that we've got all of these ideas and things that we want to do, and we're not sure what we have the power to actually enact. But I think you covered everything.
All right, I'll ask again. Anybody have any questions or comments for this group? All right. Well, I don't believe Daryl is going to be able to join us. I haven't seen him join as of yet. So he must have gotten caught up. So I know I'm not going to be able to do his discussion topic justice, but I will do my best to lead this part of our conversation. So Daryl had said something during the meeting with Chief Smith and Mayor Stoney that I thought was really got back to a discussion we had started when we first started meeting as a task force, but we haven't really completed that work yet. And he had said that that our work isn't just about the police department, it's about expanding the definition of public safety and what it means to be a public safety officer. Whether that's expanding it to social services or community members or human services broadly. He said that if we don't take that holistic approach and expand our definition to be more than just what you would what your mind might automatically go to of like the police department or the fire department or the ambulance authority. So if we don't expand our definition of public safety, we're doing ourselves a disservice. And so he had said that during the meeting with Mayor Stoney and the chief, and it made me realize we haven't really defined it as clearly. And I think we all have different ideas, but I think as part of our final report, it would be really great if we could say that we've come up, this is how we're thinking about public safety, reimagining public safety broadly. Because when you look at the content of the initial report, when you look at the direction that all of you are going, it's there, but let's put it in writing. Let's get it more solidified. And so I know early on, we sought your input on definition of public safety. And this is, can you all see that word cloud? So this is the word cloud that came back after all of your input on what does public safety mean to you. And I know we've talked about this, briefly in the past, but you've got words like protection, citizens, well-being, protected, again, life, EMS, city, police, spaces, property, you've got all of these different words in here. And I think we need to come up with our definition. And so as an exercise today, I was thinking that we could do that together, at least get a draft, something that I could send around to everyone for input later on, but really get that draft of what does public safety mean. And so I think if we could brainstorm that together right now, that would be one step forward, because that would provide all of our subgroups and our work with a little bit more of a guiding light, and ensuring that we're meeting that definition within our recommendations. If that makes sense. So does anybody want to give it a shot?
I'll start. We, before this task force, before any of this, have always looked at public safety as community first. There's policing and there's a lot of focus on policing, but public safety is also your fire department and your EMTs and how community takes care of each other. There are, a lot of groups outside of this that I talk to that say, how can we best serve each other without involving 911? And 911 doesn't just involve the police, it involves like, fire truck, ambulance, etc. So we've been talking about like how the community shows up for each other and how to prevent some physical acts of like violence and different things like that, how to make sure that people have the resources they need and things like that. So public safety is also inclusive of the community. It starts with the community, and I hope that people, will take into consideration that a lot of like crime and violence that happen come from lack of resources, lack of community like we used to have. So that's something that I'll start off with.
That's great. Anyone else want to build off of what Sheba said?
Hi, Maggie. This is Brian. I don't know if you can hear me. I like that idea with what Sheba said. So she's kind of really highlighting the shared responsibility when we think about public safety. So it's just not institutions and organizations and agencies, but it's also communities, individuals, which is something I think is great. But when I also think about public safety, I also think about public service or being a servant. And when I think about really great servants, they suspend judgment. So when we think about public safety, I think this whole notion of suspending judgment, but serving those who are in need kind of reflects my interpretation of public safety.
That's a really great point, Brian. What does everyone else think about that? Suspending judgment. I think that's a really interesting point.
That's consistent with the current theme of fair and impartial policing, where everybody is treated equally, irrespective of their backgrounds.
Yeah, where does that happen? Brian, would you be willing to share a little bit more about what you meant by that? Because that did strike me before Maggie asked the question. I'm not sure what you mean by suspending judgment in this context.
Oftentimes we've been wired to kind of discriminate, if you will, but how do we really kind of acknowledge that wiring, but then try to kind of filter that wiring out? And sometimes we have to be intentional in trying to suspend judgment. I can kind of think about examples. I'm not a police officer, but other examples in life where I've made the mistake of prejudging someone. And then, it creates some problems for me because that's something I don't want to do. I don't try to do, I don't like doing, but I have to be conscious and intentional in trying to always suspend judgment. I look at everyone as being like assets. And that's one of the things oftentimes when we think about like community building kind of processes, sometimes we might diminish the abilities of others, whoever that other might be, in terms of being an asset in the community building kind of process. So that's my whole kind of approach towards this notion of suspending judgment.
Iman, did that help answer your question?
Not fully, but I mean, I don't think it needs to be pushed further. I feel like when we're talking about, judgment in and of itself, just in the basis of why we even gathered, especially leading off with what Sheba shared, and I think she's completely correct, that when we're talking about public safety, it has to be from, at its core, a community-oriented or community-centered perspective, first and foremost. But when we're talking about the judgment, the reason we're here is because institutionally, there's judgment, if you will, that's inculcated into the actions, behaviors, and therefore the way that people, these institutions relate to particularly the people within our communities. And so I'm not so sure that if we're trying to define public safety, that it's clear to me that we're talking about, like, in what context we're talking about. I respect and understand what Brian shared in regards to interpersonal relationships and where that may be of value for me there. I don't understand it in the larger communal context within which we're working here.
Can I add something to what Iman said or build off of that?
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, go for it. Of course. Yeah.
So I was actually looking for this definition of public safety that Iman gave us sometime or shared with us sometime in August. I can't find it yet, but I put it in my notes because it was so clear, concise, and compelling. So when I find it, I'll share it. But for me, I think when I think about the public and how the public can be safe, I think that it involves the deconstruction and dismantling of structural, home-based, institutional, and transnational racism. I feel like the root cause of a lot of injustice and communities feeling unsafe and society being unsafe, especially like in the climate now with certain dog whistles that are being blown and so forth and so on, that in order for communities that are disproportionately affected by or that disproportionately feel unsafe, whether it's emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, financial, and the kind of the climate and maybe it's even the culture. I might go as far as to say the culture of the country is there has to be some acknowledgement of structural, home-based, institutional, and even transnational racism. If we don't acknowledge the truth of that and accept responsibility for that, then I find it hard to move collectively as a city, state, nation, and world towards a place where people feel safe. I know in my home right now, after certain comments or specific comments that were made even during the presidential debate, that there's a sense of like not feeling safe and wanting to take extreme out of normal for my household measures to ensure safety. So I know it's complex and there are other perspectives around, economics and things, but again, if you look at the first letter of each one of these words that I'm going to say, it's like we have to get rid of structural, home-based, institutional, transnational racism. We have to get rid of that stuff.
I agree. And I think your points about, some communities have historically always feel unsafe and continue to feel unsafe. And I think it's really interesting. You're bringing in different pieces of that definition of safety, right? And I mean, it's feeling financially unsafe and things of that nature. And I think so when it gets back to the core of what Shiva was saying before, it's about how the community takes care of each other. And I think that's really what we're trying to get at here with a lot of these recommendations. So what are other folks thinking? I know that we've heard from a few so far, but let's hear from a few other folks about, what do they think when you hear public safety? What does that mean to you? What should that mean?
Public safety is inherently perception-based, so it's subjective. So my feelings of safety are going to be different than Ram's feeling of safety, for example. And he brings up a really good point that that it varies by things like neighborhood, community, persons. So this subjectivity is going to always influence individual perceptions. So when we talk about public safety, we need to remember that what any one of us is thinking at any time is not necessarily what other people are thinking. And the things that make me feel safe or unsafe are not necessarily the things that make Ram or Natasha or Sheba feel safe or unsafe at the same time. So there's no static public safety number that we can assign to Richmond or neighborhoods within Richmond or even city blocks. So keeping in mind that it's going to vary by person, by every resident in Richmond, or even the people who come through Richmond, the people who live in the suburbs that come in for business, that come in for work. The variables that are going to influence our individual perceptions are also going to vary. So this is an enormously difficult thing to measure and even conceptualize. Sorry, I know that's not very helpful.
No, it absolutely, I mean, it absolutely is, right? Like my definition when I feel safe is going to be very different from when you feel safe, Will. And that's why, you know, some folks say, oh, a gun makes me feel safe, whereas someone else would say, oh, that makes me feel terrified. So I think
a gun in your hands would not make me feel safe.
Yeah, exactly.
But knowing that, we have to, so if we know that individual influences of what makes people feel safe and individual influences of what make people feel unsafe, we want to solicit those kinds of things. And that's what you're doing, and that's also what the listening sessions are doing. What makes people feel safe and what makes people feel unsafe? And then are some of those actionable? And many of the things are not actionable, but those that are actionable merit attention.
Does anyone else have any other input as I kind of, I'll take everybody's feedback and I'll try to smush it all together.
You know, I think that
this is Birdie.
With public safety,
I'm sorry.
that there is a standard, right? A standard of public safety. So it could be very subjective from one person to the next. But I think that there is definitely a standard, a benchmark that as a community, we can all try to meet so that everyone within that community can partake in public safety in a healthy way, right? So if I am on, you know, one side of town and I am being faced with something like racism, like institutional structural racism, like Ron was speaking about, that is not something that Will really has to experience, right?
Right.
But I still should be able to feel safe in spite of that structural racism. So maybe the standard is let's take out that structural racism, right? Within our policing, within EMS, within fire, right? I know we, you know, we don't talk a lot about the fire department and EMS and things like that, but they're slow to come to Black and brown neighborhoods, just like the police are. So where's the standard of public safety, right? If I call and I'm in an emergency and you can't get to me quickly like you can the people on the other side of town, you're not meeting the basic standard of public safety.
Yeah.
So I think we can try to work towards what we can change and what shouldn't be so difficult, and meeting just a standard public of safety for everyone.
I think that makes sense, Natasha. And I think it's kind of like, at least a minimum, you should expect this. You should be able to expect this, right? And Birdie, I think I heard you wanted to chime in as well.
Yes, I'm fading in and out, so I don't know ever when I'm in. But anyway, I think along the same lines is what keeps popping into my head is respect, and just a level of respect that should be, as someone else just said, standardized. Because I think what really makes the difference is the level of quality that people put on people's lives and property, and things that create sometimes a disparity in the way they're treated. And I think we've got to have that standard of, and someone has said, not judging people or not judging places or whatever. And I think that some way respect is very important in my mind, because you've got to have that level of, the same level of respect for all people that you're dealing with. And that makes me feel that everybody is going to be treated in a certain way.
Absolutely. And I wrote down, I think we need to include the word respect in there. I think thank you, Birdie. That's a great addition. And Natasha, I was thinking again about what you were saying. You're talking about a standard for public safety. And I think when I was thinking of different scenarios of how that plays out. It's a standard of, being treated respectfully by a police officer if you're engaging with a police officer, or if a police officer is engaging with you. It's a standard of that, your neighbors won't shoot each other and have that type of violence in your neighborhood, right? It's both when you're interacting with officials, but it's also when you're interacting within your own community as well, right? And I think that was getting to some of the point of what Daryl had been talking about expanding the definition of public safety, that there's responsibility of public safety officials, but there's a responsibility of the individual as well within a community. Corey, are you shaking your head yes or no? Or
I'm shaking my head yes, because this conversation is really resonating with the conversation that our subcommittee, the Human Service Lens Subcommittee, had on Wednesday. And it wasn't about traditional policing, but we were talking about services that are rendered to our communities. And it really started about this integrated service system where when a person entered in one organization, and if they was to go to another organization, they would be able to put their name in and kind of track to see where they're getting services from. And my concern was that I understand for the Human Service Lens and for nonprofits that serve a certain portion of the community, which unfortunately that is going to be our Black and Brown communities, that it may work and it may sound good on the surface, but it becomes a way where you're tracking certain folk. And how do we, get what we need and make sure we're not duplicating or wasting resources, but in a way that we also not allowing someone to be able to get everybody's name in a system and then use it for other reasons that may not be with good intent. And it goes back to what Birdie was just saying. It's about that respect, the quality, how we interact, because if you have private insurance and you can go to your private facilities, you would never enter into that particular system. So we know that system will be used by mostly Black and Brown families. And so how do we kind of put a level of protection? And I heard someone say, we deliver a product or quality of a service that we would deliver to anyone. And I think it goes back for me, and I was just kind of thinking with all Ram talking about this acknowledgement of the harm done. And I think until people are willing to say, yes, I do treat a certain group of people differently, only when we acknowledge that will we be willing to change it, because then we're bringing it to our consciousness. Even in sitting in here, I'm thinking about, I think it was Ron that made the statement that him and his family is looking at taking some extraordinary precautions to keep themselves safe. And I'm thinking for there are some of us that we got a real stressful situation that may present itself in November to us. Some of us live in communities where crime tend to be a little bit higher, but if things go haywire, not only do we have to worry about keeping ourselves safe in our natural surroundings, we got this extra layer that we have to begin to put into our everyday thinking. And I'm not quite sure if that's fair. So I'm just taking in everything people are saying. Very, very legitimate concerns and points being made. And now I'm trying to see how can realistically we begin to address this. It's easy to say treat everyone equally and with respect. and the mouth can say it really easily, but our actions don't always follow.
I think that there needs to be a standard, because Maggie, when you speak about, you know, the individual responsibility to public safety, I believe that accountability comes from the top down, right? And so a lot of the public safety that is lacking in high crime areas is due to a lack of economic access, right? And so there's no standard for economic access across the city. Some kids, some adults in certain sides of Richmond have much better access to economic growth than people on other sides of the city. And in those high crime areas, if you lack economic access, then crime is going to go up, right? If your neighbors are shooting each other, like the example you were saying, like why did did someone take something? Why did someone take something? Is it because they did not have it? Why didn't they have it? Because they didn't have the money to get it, right? And so you see your neighbor with it, and now you got to take it from your neighbor because you don't have the economic access to get it for yourself, right? Or the economic education. And so to my point of it being a top-down issue is that historically that economic access has been legislated out of high crime areas, right? And so that economic access needs to be legislated into those high crime areas so that those people have an option. If you give the people the option, I feel they will take that access and run with it, right? Because we haven't really seen that access being given over my lifetime. So seeing something different happen from the top down will inspire individual accountability. Because if you have economic access, if you have the ability to grow economically, then you in turn don't really have time to be shooting your neighbor because you're going to stop your dollar, right? Your kids got to eat. And that's one of the reasons why people commit crimes, because they need to put food on the table. So if you provide, if the government, the same way that they took it away, was able to provide it in those economically deprived areas, then the individual mandate to me would make sense. But until our government and people who have had this access for so long take accountability for the reasons why crime is actually so high in these areas, then we can't really push an individual mandate on individuals who do not have that access.
So that brings me to thinking about like media and how media kind of influences some things, even down to prosecution and arrest. People who are doing wrong still don't deserve to be harmed or killed in the process of being pursued. We see a whole lot of people being accused of a thing. And if we're in a nation that says you're innocent until proven guilty, that's not an option a lot of times in our communities. And people start to make judgments and people start to say, this person was killed because they committed a crime or they did a thing. And nobody goes back to address like what happened, what the issue was and what led up to it, like Natasha said. So, that's a part of public safety, people's lives being invaded, people attacking certain people as things come out without having all of the story. This happens like all too often, like in our communities. We see a person in handcuffs, we see a person's mugshot versus seeing a person's senior picture, and people start to judge and tear away from their lives. So I know in our group, I think our co-chairs were talking about what policies were going through session that we could get behind, because like Tori and Natasha and a lot of us said, there are not enough protections to say, just don't be biased. We asked for qualified immunity because people were being harmed and were not being given the option to file a formal complaint and have it be addressed, not just adjudicated, but even be addressed, and that's ongoing. So we say, oh, treat us fair, treat us like you treat everyone else. And when it got to a point where we knew that that was not happening, we said, okay, well, let's make it a law. And you see how little our Black and brown communities are respected because that was fought tooth and nail. I'm talking about just having basic protections for people who have been violated and abused for years. We didn't say don't be fair. We didn't say make it more difficult for a police officer to do their job in our communities. We said that we recognize that if you're in the rich part of the West End, that the same crime can be dealt with in a manner that is respectful and dignified. But if you are in a high crime area, and I put that in quotations because that's the narrative that we get, it's okay to beat the hell out of somebody who you accuse of a crime. Nobody goes back after that person is acquitted. Nobody goes back after they're not found guilty and say, we ran this story about this person's life and their background and their history, and we embarrassed them, but they didn't do this thing. Nobody goes back and covers that unless you're privileged. So, we've asked for parity, we've asked for equity, we've asked for equality and respect for so long that if we were given that option, we wouldn't be here on this task force. So I think that it requires more measures than just saying, hey, treat us the same as you treat everybody else. I think that it requires standards that are defined. And I know that it seems difficult, but like Ram said, we're looking at, we have a president of a nation saying to a white nationalist group, stand down and stand by. And I am a licensed concealed carry holder, but I have to worry about protecting my family from people who want to cause harm, and then protecting myself from being killed by a police officer who comes up and says, you're Black, you shouldn't have a gun, even though it was given, to me, even though I follow all of the rules and laws, we're looked at differently. Like, we don't have the luxury of just saying, just writing down, just putting into a report that we want to be treated the same. Something has to be done that requires that being mandated to a point where if you have bias, it is addressed appropriately. So I'm getting into things that go beyond just having a standard that's written. And before people say, all police officers aren't bad, all EMS treat people fairly, all of them show up to the scene and make a judgment call whether or not a person should get opiates or pain treatment or whatever because of their insurance or their history, whatever the case may be. That's just not been happening. So I don't know where we kind of take it from there, but this is the very reality of what we're dealing with. We have asked and asked and asked for decades, and if we were being obliged in a fair and impartial manner, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And I think that people forget that accusing somebody or seeing somebody who doesn't have certain access to resources or certain resources, that it's okay to treat them a certain way.
If I may, this whole notion of quote unquote mutual respect and or mutual standards of living, they all have to be carried out in the context of a culture. Like these aren't just nebulous things that all of a sudden, whether they're written or however they're presented to people, all of a sudden everyone just takes on and absorbs. They're carried out in a particular cultural context. And the problem, as you've been articulating, Sheba, is just that we have a culture that people are not willing to admit that allows and affords power to specific institutions to be able to harm us with impunity, and no one is willing to do anything about it. That is the problem. And I stand by that, and I feel like until we're able to take that power away, whatever that means, if we're not willing to relinquish that, to remove that power, and certainly I have no expectation that anyone's willing to relinquish that power, then this whole notion of treating each other fairly with respect is a fairy tale that we'll be chasing, until our children are having these conversations. I don't think that, I think it's far more than just a conversation about mutual respect. But if we don't start at the core of that basis of where those biases, how the institutional racism actually plays out, what do we mean? What are we talking about specifically when we see this institutional or structural racism manifesting within our communities? If we're not willing to deal with that and say, okay, I can pinpoint this here, and this is what we need to do to eliminate that. If we're not willing to do that, then trying to develop a universal, I don't want to say universal, but trying to develop a community applicable definition of public safety, that becomes a exercise in futility. We have to allow the definition to be developed on the basis of those things that we know are continuing to contribute to the perpetual harm that occurs, within our communities, and it has to start there.
Brian, I see you, and then also I just want to note that Daryl's here, and I know, Daryl, this had been part of an exercise that we had talked about, and I mentioned what you had said about expanding the definition of public safety, and the meeting with the mayor and the chief, and how I think us thinking through that as a task force and working on that expanded definition. That's the conversation we're having now, just to catch you up to speed on that. And then Brian, I saw you, and then Daryl, maybe we can come back to you.
Hey Daryl, how you doing?
I'm good. How you doing, Brian?
All right. So, I just wanted to kind of, this may not be a definition of public safety, but more of a process of public safety, the way I see it evolving from this conversation. And as I say this, I don't mean to say that this isn't done to some degree right now, but I think enhancing what we do in the capacity I'll explain here in a minute is kind of where I feel like this task force is leading me anyway. So, public safety historically, most people in particular just think of public safety as law enforcement, federal, state, and local doing their job to protect the public. But I think that obviously needs to broaden. And quite frankly, I've always, well, not always, but in the last 20 years, I've always believed in this concept of prevention, intervention, and enforcement and you could probably throw some other strategies in there along with that as being a significant and important part of total public safety, because certainly if you can prevent something from happening, that's a big win. And if you can intervene before it happens, if it's in the process, that's a big win too. The last resort enforcement is always should always be what you're hoping for to do last. And the other thing about is that the responsibility of public safety is broadened. It involves law enforcement, but it involves human services. It involves nonprofits, faith-based, and most importantly, maybe it involves the community. And I think that that is something that we can always do better at, in my experience. And so that all of that together has to be very collaborative, and we have to create an overall comprehensive strategy involving all those components. And I'm sure I missed a few of those components. And I will say this, that public safety is different from when you're talking about public safety strategies. They are different for different communities because different communities have different needs. And so they are individually created for the specific needs of those those communities. And whether or not we need to look at that in a critical way, I'm not so sure. I wouldn't even know how to approach equalizing public safety across the board. I think that's would be a very difficult thing to do. I think certainly the way people are treated, I mean, that's basic instinct, and of course everybody needs to be treated equally. But as far as like creating strategies to address whatever the specific needs are of a community, those have to be somewhat customized, if you will. And so that's just my takeaway, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Daryl, I'll turn it over to you.
So it sounds like, I first want to apologize to the group. I had a meeting that went over that I could not, it started at 2 and it went way over than I expected. So I want to apologize to you all. Sounds like you all are having a really good discussion. Have you all looked at, in the beginning, we had a current definition. I think Brian provided us a couple definitions of public safety currently. I don't know I don't believe this comes specifically from the city of Richmond. But did you all talk about that at all?
No, we didn't. I brought up your word cloud, Daryl, that we had talked about, and I just discussed what you had said in the meeting with the chief and the mayor. We didn't go back to Brian's initial presentation.
Yeah, and the reason why I definitely think that's important, because I think sometimes, we have certain themes and principles in our society, right? And what ends up happening is we don't live up to those themes and principles that we tend to espouse. So I think part of what I've been encouraged by, and part of what's been coming up, is that through the task force, and again, I've said this last week, we were able to present our recommendations to the mayor. And as we were there presenting them, I was very happy with what we were able to come up with. I've shared this before, I'm shared again. I think where we started, right, with people from varying backgrounds and understandings of ways of doing things, and what we were able to put together, I think for me, what we were talking about is how do we look at what current definitions were and how do we expand that to include community, and expanding the definition of who can be a public safety officer is. So I know you all were having conversations. So I don't know if we have enough time. Are we planning, do we want to talk a little bit about like who could be included in the definition of a public safety officer? Because again, I feel bad because I'm coming into this really late, and I don't even know if I should still be facilitating.
I said I was doing my best, but I wasn't going to do it as much justice as you, Daryl. So what we've kind of talked about is just, I left it kind of open-ended for folks of what public safety means to them. And I think your point of, who's a public safety officer isn't something we've quite gotten into yet. So if we want to maybe shift to that direction a little bit, because I know when we're thinking about reimagining public safety and who responds to, calls that folks need assistance with, I think, that's something that could be, discussed a little bit there. But yeah, Daryl, I think that's a good point to shift the conversation.
You're on mute.
I just want to get a sense if everybody else is on board with that, because and that's not trying to undermine what you're saying, Maggie, but I just want to make sure that everybody is, if we're all on the same page and in agreement.
Yes.
So I will share what Brian shared with me. Let me see if I can make it bigger first. All right, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Take a few things off my little. All right, so see if I can make this bigger. That good?
We only see your desktop, or at least I only see your desktop.
Can we see my desktop? All right, let me stop sharing then, because I don't know what's on my desktop. All right. How about now?
Yep, there we go.
All right. So these are some of the definitions that that Brian had provided us in the beginning. Because I think in the beginning we were so focused on police officers. I really appreciate the task force because we actually through particularly in my subcommittee, I know James and Keisha have been talking about it's not just about police. Let's stop just talking about police, because if we're talking about changing, I feel like we're talking about culture shifting and culture changing. Even when I read the what is in the section for community engagement, what we're talking about even in community engagement is how do we empower the community to take ownership and also take ownership for our healing and move forward, right? So I think all of this is going to be relevant and important. So some of the themes that he pulled out for public safety themes were people focused, defends, protects from all dangers, seeks to prevent and respond to inclusive concept, right? So I don't think this is a public theme that is currently observed, but looking at the public safety definition, says public safety is people focused and not property or profit focused. Public safety seeks to defend and protect all people from hurt, harm, and danger that is man-made and because of a natural occurrence. This is an inclusive concept that impacts various government agencies and covers all social services. The appreciation for, understanding, and application of this concept is dependent upon the various perceptions of the public. So that's the definition that Brian gave us. I don't think that's the city's definition. So I apologize again. I think I did have that, but I don't have it with me. And then I know there's a definition of public safety officers. So from the definition that I looked up, public safety officers typically include law enforcement officers, which is police. It typically includes corrections officers, fire and EMS, if I'm is who is included in that. So and what we're doing and what we're talking about, particularly on the Human Services Committee, is if we're expanding this definition of public safety, we're looking at mental health professionals, because when we look at some of the data and we look at what police are responding to, what we've been finding is that they're responding to things like mental health and disorderly conduct. And what we've talked about is how do we include them in that? So, and if we do start to include community in that, I would hope that we look at ways that we can provide some type of resource, funding and things like that to make sure that these services and these other public safety officers have the ability to do the work that needs to be done in the community. So I think that's where I would open up the conversation for other people in terms of what the definition is and who do we imagine we would include in that discussion of a public safety officer.
When I take a look at this and the definition here for public safety, honestly, I see where all of these examples, like it's racism, right? Housing, health, education, employment, etc. The link here is racism and how that doesn't affect certain people in our city and how it does explicitly affect others in our city, right? So when we're talking about the police and the issues that are present there, what we're really talking about is racism. When we're talking about housing, and the difficulties and why Richmond is like second in the nation for evictions. What we're really talking about is racism. Education. We literally teach white children to be racist. And we teach Black children to be okay with being subjugated to racism. That's what's happening. Employment. It's a right to work state. Who gets fired first? Racism. And on and on and on. So if we're going to talk about public safety and how we can make this a fair space, we really need to start talking about the racism that exists in all of these elements. Because in education, we need to have a curriculum that is specifically anti-racist across the board, so that we can start to undo the damage that has been done. In housing, the amount of racism that happens in housing is absolutely ridiculous. And so we need to start talking about how and why we are a landlord-friendly state in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a rising eviction crisis, why we still want to protect landlords and not people. Because the people who are being evicted are Black and brown folks. Racism. Employment. Why is it so hard for Black and brown people to remain employed? To even get employment, right? Racism. So I think we need to really start having the conversation about racism and why it is the detriment of not only our city, our state, but this entire country.
Thank you, Natasha. I definitely agree, because, you know, when you look at all of these areas of activity, what you'll find is that Black and brown people are overly represented in homelessness, in, you know, dropout rates and things like that. And it's kind of what I was saying earlier too, like you affirmed what I was saying in terms of like, we have these definitions a lot of times that espouse these values, but in reality, they're not being lived out. So, you know, the question is, how do we get from there to there? And I think that's where the subcommittee of the community engagement and healing subcommittee comes in, because like what we're talking about is, you know, and even on the use of force, there were a lot of recommendations that I saw that were really trying to get at, you know, how do we address some of these well, I can't even call it an underlying issue. It's not really underlying of racism. Anybody else?
Daryl, just for clarity, we've been quiet today. Doesn't mean we're not engaged, but we all agree.
No, I mean, it's a difficult, and that's why I said I really appreciate this task force, is because we're having difficult conversations, right? And we got to have the difficult conversations because, you know, we can't sit here and act like, you know, we just got here overnight. I think this is from a lot of the work that we've been doing, a lot of the things that we've been looking at, particularly, I can't not that I can't not unsee it, but like when I look at the heat maps, all the data points to the same things. We look at data all the time. We talked about, I know in our subcommittee, we looked at the heat maps, and when you look at certain areas where all of these calls are going out on, and we look at another area of town, and it looks like, as one of our task force members said, it doesn't look like they even speed in that area. That speaks to how in the same city, with the same police force, how certain areas are policed versus others. So we have to kind of, you know, put all this out on the table to then be able to say, okay, well, we know this to be true. So what are we going to do about it? So I think this has to go into our recommendations of, needs to be in our recommendations.
So I think something stood out the other day in our subgroup. One person said, I've never had a good interaction with a police officer. And one of our police officers said, that is like a slap in the face because we have great police officers. And it set with me because we have we live in the same city. We've all kind of been here our whole lives, and it is unconscionable to think that she's never had a great interaction, right? But that is very real lived experience for a lot of people of color. Um, and for our police, it is very hard to be in camaraderie with people who patrol this city and work the same job and have these interactions together to feel like that is a true statement. So I challenge people to think beyond your experience because it could be both and. He may have never experienced a bad situation from his standpoint, and she may have never experienced a good situation from her experience. So I think that's what we see a lot of times because I may say, this thing happened. I was pulled over for something simple like a brake light being on. I had a gun pointed in my face. And people who have never experienced that will say, that's ridiculous. It had to be something else. Or you must have done something to deserve that. The rebuttal will come back to people who have been harmed to say, you haven't been harmed because I haven't been harmed. And I think when we're talking about what were we saying earlier about removing the bias, that is something that also has to be addressed because we tend to tell people that you shouldn't feel this way because I never experienced that. And this is happening every day. There are people who run. They run when they see the police for no other reason than I just don't want to go through the hassle of being stopped and asked, where are you going? Where are you coming from tonight? What are you doing? Because we expect the worst. And then there are some people who say, I don't have to go anywhere. I'm not worried about this. If I'm not doing anything wrong, then why do I need to, stop what I'm doing? Because they don't have the same experiences. So I want people to think about before you tell a person, and it's just like suicide. If you're working the hotline and you're on the phone and somebody says, this has just been the worst year ever, and I just don't feel like I should be able to go on. You would never be trained to tell that person, that's not true. Don't worry about that. So I want people to think about when people share their experiences, their very real lived experiences about what they feel and what they experience, to not just say, that's not possible because I haven't experienced it, or I don't believe that this is how you feel or how you got here. Because what I hear is we want to change from one standpoint, and then somebody else saying, oh, there's nothing wrong with the system as it stands.
Thank you, thank you, Sheba, for sharing that because that is a really um, honest perspective that we must take a look at. Um, we can't always judge another person's experience through our lens. So thank you for saying those words.
Yes, thank you, Sheba. I'm looking at the chat and I see Iman where you put in that some people aren't willing to admit that they see my statement before as extreme or an exception, right? And that speaks to Sheba's point. Like some people just don't see it would be extreme, or there must be some type of exception. But can we have that conversation as to why the idea that racism is the seed that sprouts all trouble is an extreme idea? Why is racism in housing and in health and in education and in policing why is that extreme to talk about when it's just a fact? I think we have to be more open to having real conversations about the real issues that are affecting us as a community, right? And racism is at the core of those issues. And I think the difference is that the people who experience racism and the people who dish out the racism have there's a line there. And so it's hard to cross that line, but you can't dismiss somebody's experience. If I have received racism through housing, if I have had to deal with racism in employment, in education, in pretty much all aspects of my life, it is not fair to then say, oh, I'm just being extreme, or that my lived experience is the exception when it is indeed the rule. Black people, brown people, LGBTQ people in our community live with this every single day. So let's start talking about the real issue of racism and why it has created the divide in policing and communities, why it's created the divide in economic access, how and why it's created the divide in education services, right? My entire life, Richmond Public Schools has been lackluster, to say the least. So, let's really pinpoint it. It's because that's where the Black kids go. That's where the brown kids go. So it's not extreme. It's accurate, and we need to start talking about it so that we can move forward. My parents, my grandparents, their parents, everybody in my lineage has been saying the same thing for generations. So why is this extreme?
And Natasha, I would further say, I think part of why things continue to go on is that we address these little symptoms by trying to put band-aids or try to redirect the problem and blame the victim. Cynthia, did you have something you wanted to say? I saw you come off mute.
Who, me?
I was saying Cynthia. I thought I saw Cynthia come off mute.
I just wanted to say something. Like, I've heard the word. Do y'all hear that reverberation?
We hear echo.
Is that because some people have their mics on? Like, if everybody mutes, we might not hear it. So this conversation is part of the work that I do, conversations on racism. And I've heard the word racism like 25, 30 times. And I've heard it from certain people. And it just raises the question that, well, this is an observation, the people that have been talking about racism are, basing it on their experience. Of course, the data substantiates it. Some people might not believe the data substantiates it. But my point is, for the people who've been talking about racism, just from my experience and expertise in this field, you're not descendants of the people that created racism, yet you're the ones that are talking about racism. And racism is not a blame game or trying to individualize and call people out. Sometimes, though, when this conversation is going on, it feels like a type of voyeurism where the people who are adversely affected by it are the ones talking about it, but the people who belong to quote unquote dominant group that descended from the originators or the creators of this racist system stand back and don't say anything. And I think that's an important observation to make in these conversations. And it's also important to compel people to speak on it, to speak on like, I disagree with that, or yes, we understand that. The theme here is acknowledgement. And just to be blunt, if white people don't acknowledge the harm that's been caused by this system that was created by white people, racism was created by white people, and white people have an obligation to dismantle and deconstruct it. But sitting back and not saying anything about it, and I learned this from one of my partners, to have, I guess, the courage to just call it out. If white folks don't start talking about it, one, it's exhausting for Black people and brown people, and two, it stagnates us in this process of healing that needs to take place. And let's just talk about the task force enrichment. Task force enrichment, like that right there is fertile ground for a discussion about how the events that led to the task force forming can be addressed, to start to unpack it and to, I don't know, exemplify or create a process where, in this situation here that we're in, I mean, like, we're calling out an institution, we're calling out a structure, we're calling out something that we all know happens in our homes. We talk about this in our homes. And in full transparency, we might not want to say all the things that we say in our homes, but we definitely talk about it in our homes. And then it's not something that's just isolated to us. So it's, it's like 400 years this conversation is 400 years in the making. Let's step up and not stand by. Let's step up and step forward to try and untangle and have the courage and the faith and the respect to really acknowledge that there is different treatment based on something biological, melanin in our skin. But we have a whole system that's designed to hold certain people down. And I think it would be refreshing for me to hear white people to really speak on, like, what is your perspective on this? Like, don't leave it to Black people to always talk about this ish. That's what the acronym of structural, home-based, institutional, and transgenerational means. Like, this is, you hear people talk about this is life and death. So it's just the observation, and maybe it's a request. It's a request to hear that perspective on this.
Hi, I'm kind of gonna jump in there because I know a lot of people have been saying the white people and white folks, and in my community, the same how we all feel that, oh, the white people are the ones, being racist. Let's be honest, you guys wanted honesty. Black folks are the same way towards the Latino population. I don't know if it's the language barrier. I don't know, a lot of kids, we have more in common than what they think. But at the end of the day, it's very different racism when it is coming from all over. It is coming from dark skin, it's coming from light skin, it's just coming all over. If you guys want to talk about, racism, then it's going to be seen as very different subjects for their different people. In my case, it comes from all over. I know it plays a big part right now of the movement, but we've been fighting this racism way before slaves were even over here, with the colonizations. So I don't know, it's really hard to say that let's just bring it into the white folks. or in my case, I think that's really hard to just point that out. But I just wanted to put my 2 cents in there.
I love that you said that. I just would ask a question. Is that racism? Because can Black people determine where Latinx people go to school? And it's not about people, it's about a system. Can Black people determine where Latinx people live? Can Black people determine whether or not Latinx people get a loan to buy a house?
Well, I mean, then we see it like that. I mean, who are like, okay, school districts, who are the ones in our district representing us? It's white and Blacks.
And so again, with the educational system, who determines the curriculum? Who determines the funding? Who determines? So it's not so much about people, it's about the system. So I think sometimes that's what makes it hard to have the conversation, because we individualize it and look at it as it's a personal thing when it's more of a structural thing and a systemic thing. So a Black person might not like a white person. They might say, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. But the white person can still get the loan. The white person can still get different treatment when it comes to going to court. It's a system that we're talking about. It's not a personal attack on a person or an individual. I think if we look at it more as a system, then we'll see that's the opportunity, and that's what I'm trying to say. That's the opportunity for us to collaborate together to work against a system that's oppressive against people of color for the most part, but people of different economic means too. So, and I hear what you're saying too about the Black-brown conflict that really has to be addressed. I'm not dismissing that. I'm just saying that the root cause of this is systemic versus personal. And I that's going to be my talks for today, because I don't want to take up all the space.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I was just addressing the part, Natasha, and then what you said, and you did narrow it down, white folks. That's why I addressed that part, but I totally agree also with the rest. I mean, that's why I said, I guess we have to just narrow it down, and people are gonna feel uncomfortable because the situations that they don't wanna be seen. They don't wanna say a comment and then be destroyed by saying that comment and never, it's not forgiven. It doesn't mean that's my point of view of the whole situation. It's just a point of view. Yeah.
Can I say something? And I think part of what I would always, I have these conversations all the time, because I think when we talk about race and racism, we do get into this conversation where we're using these words and we're not speaking from the same definitions, right? So I agree with Cynthia that there is prejudice. Black people can be prejudiced and discriminate. Anybody can be prejudiced and discriminate. However, like Ram is saying, when we're talking about racism, we have to be mindful of what we're talking about, which is the systems, which is what Natasha is also pointing out. It's the system of housing, it's the system of education, and how it benefits one group over the others. And I would say, as we're looking at, because I think we have a beautiful, and again, I don't know where that is going. So we have a nice document in terms of recommendations. I also think that attached to that, I think we may also need to, as we're talking about expanding definition of public safety, I think we need to also be clear for not necessarily us. I think for most people, they understand that, but as people are reading the document, we may need to also provide some specific definitions so people understand what we're talking about, so we're coming from the same point of location.
So we started this discussion today with a definition of public safety. And I think that we all agreed that public safety is a private thing, right? It depends on each of our own perspective, each of our own lived experiences. So just going back to the woman who just spoke, her experience, her truth with racism doesn't have to be the same as everyone else's in this meeting. So I just want to make that point just to tie in. We did make that acknowledgement at the beginning of the discussion that even though we're talking about something that happens in the public space, it is very much a private person-to-person experience.
And I would like to add that mimicry is a part of this racist system, right? And in the society that we live in, people who can get closest to the power of that racist structure seem to find the way to do so at any means, right? I live at a few intersections, right? One of them being LGBTQ, right? So I receive prejudices from people about my sexual orientation quite often, right? And those people sometimes look just like me. And so I know that, you know, mimicry in hate is also an issue within this racist structure. So I completely, you know, I agree with what you're saying, Cynthia, because I also, you know, if I hear you correctly, I hear what you're saying in that it's, you know, it's dished out from all sides, right? And for me as well, it is dished out from all sides. So I don't think that you are, you know, being disingenuous at all. I totally understand what you're saying. And even in other, you know, if we look at other cultures, right? Latina dad, right? So we look at Latina dad, and we know that Black people who are a part of Latina dad are not necessarily included in that conversation, right? It's hard to find a Black person on in the telenovelas, right? But that is the being the proximity to the power of a racist structure. So, you know, I think you're right. I think we're hitting the nail on the head here, and how easy it is to turn into an oppressor versus being, you know, having to constantly live as the oppressed, right?
Yeah, I was gonna add, and so in the novelas, dark skin usually does play the servant, and we do see it even as something that we're growing up with. Indigenous, dark skinned, we're always played the servant, you know. So yeah, you're right on that. And when it comes to Latinos, that's a whole different level of racism there. It does play a big part, and it's also with the Latinx, even the Latinx and Latinos, that's a very different. There's so many different levels of everything.
Right. But I think the root of it is, you know, when you live as an oppressed person, when given the opportunity to be the oppressor, a lot of people take it, right? To actually feel what that feels like, to be able to identify what that power feels like. And so a part of dismantling racism and prejudices is speaking to that. You know, how can we find a way to make sure that people, when given that opportunity, can choose to identify with the differences that they see in the person across from them, instead of trying to identify with the ways in which they can oppress that person across from them.
I hear that, and I hear what you stated as well, Cynthia. What I'd like to ask, because I'm not necessarily in agreement with the idea. It appears that what we're attempting to say is that concepts can't be clearly defined. As a result, their only relevant definition is based on whatever they are for any individual. And I don't know that I believe that to be the case. I think that part of what Ram was attempting to address in terms of giving I'll say, for lack of a better term, a formal definition for racism, by pointing out distinctions in terms of our interaction as individuals and where that stems from. The fact that there's conflict between, people use this term, Black and brown peoples, is an extension of white violence. It's an extension of our experience living here, and generation after generation growing up under certain circumstances that Natasha used the word mimicry, that I like that. That create conditions for an antagonistic, if you will, relationship. It's the same thing that happens within communities of people of African descent, where we go at each other and people, for all other purposes, call it some sort of internal racism. That's a symptom. It's a byproduct of it. I don't necessarily see it as being the same thing. Ultimately, the fact that those conflicts are there absolutely have to be addressed. I mean, there are definitely things that need to be talked about. However, at least for me, in the context of this conversation about public safety and what that means and how we intend to transform it, or in what ways we intend to affect it so that we are reducing harm for folks that are most impacted, I think that creates a different layer of the conversation in terms of where and what we address, if you will, at the root, other than the conflicts that have manifest, if you will, in the way that I would define it, well, between non-white peoples. There's a history that's there that created the conflict that happens in quote unquote Black and brown communities, and that history is a part of what that larger definition, if you will, of the racist structure really encompasses. I guess I'm interested in what, and not just not just you, Cynthia, or Natasha, the two of you, because you just happen to have spoken up, but what do people see in general when I'll say, for lack of a better term, we're talking about the institutions, excuse me, some of them we can argue at this point are headed by Black people, some and in some instances headed by brown people that service our community. What do you see in terms of their roles with regard to enacting the kind of power that either can change the conditions within our individual communities, or that continue to negatively impact the conditions within our individual communities, and if they have a role in that, and they're able to, for lack of a better term, affect it in they have the power, I should say, to affect it in a certain way, then should not our focus be on the power that's present? Shouldn't our focus be on removing that power, eliminating that power, identifying that power, naming what that power is, and being able to say, well, no, you should not be able to do X, because this, when you come into our community and do it, it causes harm. Like that to me is the thing that I feel that that creates a level of distinction, because at some point there's a source for that power. There's a source for it. There's identifiable source, and there's an identifiable culture that maintains that power, whether we're cognizant of it or not. And so I'm interested in what folks have to say about that.
I know it wasn't your attempt, Iman, but somehow I feel like Cynthia's statement was kind of dismissed, for, I'm gonna use your word, lack of a better term. And I feel like she clearly was talking about something that Natasha was sharing, is that, you know, they can get these bias and races and this discrimination from several different angles. And I just want to make sure that we're not doing to her what we often have said done to us as Black people. You know, kind of get our statements and what we're saying dismissed. And I just say, in my own personal thing, something about this just don't feel comfortable to me. And I don't think anybody was trying to dismiss her. That's just the way I'm hearing it. The other thing that I know this is a conversation, and Maud, I really appreciate you taking the initiative to bring it to the forefront and have these conversations, because I do feel like we're really beginning to talk about a difficult issue, not necessarily for us to talk about, but for our white counterparts. And I but then I kind of got lost about where are we at with redefining public safety. So we started out in one direction and we ended up in another. And I kind of feel like where we left off at with the definition of public safety, but I clearly know that this conversation has to happen also. And in this setting, it really is just between a few people. Everybody's not truly engaged in that. And I just want to, like, I just can't help but feel like somehow we didn't totally acknowledge Cynthia's truth. So that's it. I might be mistaken, but that's just how I feel about it.
I kind of wanted to say something too, right? So when I look at the definition of public safety, when I listen to even consider, and I replay back, you know, even from what you're saying, Tori, about, I think what we're talking about, you can't remove the two. We cannot remove the conversation about racism from this discussion about public safety. I think it has to be baked in the cake, right? Because if I go back to what the definition that Brian provided us, it says is people focused, not property or profit focused. Seeks to defend and protect all people from hurt, harm, and danger that is man-made or because of a natural occurrence. I would also think, as we're talking about healing as a component of this, I think we have to, you know, reckon with sort of like what Cynthia's talking about, right? Like, how do we heal from, because and what I think other people, like what other people are pointing to is like particularly how Natasha put it so eloquently, the mimicry, right? How we when we get the opportunity to be in the oppressor's shoes, or, you know what I'm saying, we do that. I think that's a part of the healing. I think sometimes people are acting things out without fully being conscious and aware of what they're doing, right? Because that's, you know, Neely Fuller said, if you don't understand racism, white supremacy, everything else will confuse you, right? And, you know, it's sort of the same thing where, like, people tend to get confused, and you see a lot of times where, you know, you have a police involved shooting and they put, it could be of a Black or brown person, you put the Black or brown person in front as the public official to deliver the verdict, right? And again, and then they say, well, or they say, well, it's the Black officer that shot the person. And I think what we're going back to is that, you know, yeah, it's a Black officer that is representing that system. So, yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm talking in circles, and I think I'm, you know, just basically reiterating everything that everybody's saying. But I really feel like in us expanding the definition of public safety, we cannot exclude understanding, you know, the impacts of racism and oppression. You know, because if we're espousing that public safety means to protect everyone from harm, right? And we don't do the thing we don't address the thing that is actually causing the harm, which is the discrimination and oppression, then, you know, it's just words on paper.
I agree, but what I'm saying too, Daryl, is that this is a conversation. It's a difficult conversation, and I do feel like we're having it amongst ourselves. I think that was something that Ron pointed out in the beginning. But what I'm also saying is that I would like us to clearly state what that public safety definition should be. I think people gave some good insight about just treating everybody with respect. If you are able to go, as they say in the West End, and deal with a call and have a different outcome than when you have in the East End, then we know you're not treating everybody with the same level of respect. So I would like for us to clearly state what that definition for the city of Richmond, because that's where we're starting at, should be. And then as you state that, because if you're going to treat everyone with a level of respect, then we got to acknowledge why you didn't do it from the beginning. And that's when we know part of that is because of the bias, the racism, and discrimination that happened. Sometimes it's because of color. Sometimes it's because of social economic. Sometimes it can be, and a lot of times it's between male, female. But however it happens, it still is not respect. And so I think we need to start there and then move from there. I think it does lead into the conversation that Iman had. And I do think that it is time that others come into this conversation, but it's a little concerning that they don't, because maybe they're just not quite there yet. So I hear you.
Yeah, I'd like to know how we can get white people to join in on this conversation. You know, that'd be really good. Really good if white people on this call actually jumped in and started talking about the racism that exists within our community. I think we would get a lot further than what we're getting now.
I see we got pretty much less than a minute left on this call. Oh, Brian.
Yeah, I'll speak. I mean, look, I've said this before, and so I hate to just repeat myself. And look, and I really appreciate this conversation. Don't think that I do. And of course, we all recognize that our own experiences are different, obviously, and my experiences are different than everybody on this call. But I will say this, and I've said it before. I said, racism exists. It exists in law enforcement, exists on the people on this phone call or Zoom call. It exists everywhere I've ever been. But I want to say that in my experience within law enforcement, and we're talking mostly about law enforcement here, I have a difficult time subscribing to systemic racism because, as Daryl said earlier, we all are kind of going at this at a different definition. And if we clarify that definition, I may be more on board with that. But I think we're here because of systemic racism, and I can list things that were done and historically, that even in recent history, that have gotten us to this point. And of course, I use the most apparent to me, of course, is public housing, and the fact that we have passed the buck over decades and decades and decades. And I still look outside my window at Gilpin Court, and that to me is systemic racism at the fact that we're still there. But when it comes to law enforcement, in my experience, in the last 20 years at least, I did witness racism. I absolutely did. I had a black partner at one time that I witnessed it with him, and I could never come to the conclusion based on my experience that it is systemically racist if you are going to include the men and women that serve the people, because I didn't see that. And I know people on this call that have experienced it. I have seen it, but it systemically, to me, is a broad definition over that includes a lot of good men and women that take on that job to serve the public in the best way they can. So there you go. I mean, I don't think we're that far apart, but we are apart. I think, at least I am, of course, and I think that we need to be cognizant of that. I think there's, I think Nixon's on here, but me being one of the only law enforcement people on here, I feel as though if this subcommittee or this committee came out and that being a finding and expecting a response from law enforcement that would align itself with that kind of statement, I think that we have to be careful as to how we make that statement, as to be sensitive to the men and women that serve each and every day to protect us, because I think that would be a very difficult thing to adopt. It would be definitely, if I was a chief, or if I ran ATF again, or whatever it was, that would be a difficult thing for me to come out and say, yeah, I support what the task force said. So there you go. I spoke up. Thank you, Keisha.
I appreciate that, Brian. But I think that we're not looking at systems. I think that we can agree that we have a black chief, a black Commonwealth attorney, a black mayor, and we still are incarcerated at the highest rates. We still are over sentenced, overcharged, over incarcerated at the highest rates. I think that the police as a system target black and brown folks at a higher rate than others. I think that, you're saying, I'm looking at each individual person, but if you're going to, I think on our very first call, it may not have been you, it may have been Brad that said, I patrol the most violent areas in the city, and that means that I lived on Raven Street, and you are looking at me when I get pulled over and say, you are violent. So it's the same thing. If I say that I expect to go to jail in my lifetime because of where I live, I'm not saying Officer Williams, Officer Nixon, Officer Carol Adams is the exception, but in our communities, we don't get to have an exception. So I think that when we're looking at systemic, we're talking about mass incarceration. We're talking about the difference in how a police stop goes. I think we're talking about how areas are patrolled and how many people we see in the court system, and how fines and fees and the felonization, rules forever in a person's life. I think that we're talking about the policies in place that make sure that certain people are entrapped in systems forever. I think that we do a short stop at saying, if this black officer comes through the police department, then they're automatically racist. I think that we're addressing the system of how they're trained to address certain communities. And I know we had a discussion like in our subgroup about how do we see our communities when we approach them? Do you see them as the most violent? Do you see them as the most dangerous? Or do you see them as the most under-resourced, underserviced, different things like that? So I think we came back full circle to looking at it through different lenses. But I think the police historically represent, structural, racism and a system of racism and systems of oppression.
And Brian, I really, I really feel like I hear what you're saying. What you're saying is what I interpreted you to say is that because I have a relationship with these people and I have a relationship with them and I know their hearts, I know that systemic racism doesn't exist. But that's not the definition of systemic racism. Drive around Richmond, right? Look at how they created, for example, like the Big Six, right? Look at how the community was designed. That's systemic. And then you have a police force, right, that has to enforce law, right? So it's not about the people and their heart, the individuals that we're talking about, right? It's the system that we're talking about that contributes to that. And they're all interconnected, right?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I think that systemic racism got us to where we are today. And I think that the resources need to be given to get us out of the system that we're in with regard specifically, I'm speaking specifically to public housing. I think that the fact that we're there the way we are today, and I was here in the 80s, that looks exactly the same. That's a travesty. Their politicians, governments have passed the buck down the line over decades, and this is absolutely unacceptable. I agree with you on that 110%. The problem is law enforcement looks at that, and look, I met with my RTO this week. I mean, they literally said, "We want you to lock it down." This is what the citizen said to me in the meeting. We want you to lock it down. I mean, they want enforcement in there to help, because these people, the good people, and the 99% of the people that live there are good people, want to feel safe, and they don't. I've knocked on doors where a woman answered the door and she looked at me. I told her who I was, and she bawled. She just started crying and I said, "Why are you crying?" She goes, "Because I'm afraid when my 6-year-old gets off the school bus, he's not going to make it to the house." They want to feel safe. And the only way we have of making them safe at this point is to have some type of presence there to make them feel that way. And they want that. And they feel that when there's a patrol car sitting out in the neighborhood or a patrolman walking through the neighborhood. And so I hear what you're saying, but it's much more complex than that. I am not immune to what is going on in our communities. And there's a lot of people that have died in my communities from violence from black on black. And that is a much bigger, in my opinion, it's much more relevant for me at least, issue that we have to deal with as well. And our law enforcement officers, they're there to protect, but this is what they experience on a regular basis. So so we all have our experiences. We have to recognize that.
I think that when you go to a group of people that had a lot of crime in their communities, and they may say, "We want you to lock it down," they're not, what they're saying and what you're hearing are probably totally different things. And so then the conversation may need to go a little bit further. What do you mean when you say you want me to lock it down? Because when I hear you say you want me to lock it down, this is what it's going to look like. So is this, y'all need to make sure you're on the same page, because you hear in lockdown, and then in your mind, what that may look like may be totally different from what their intent was. And I would just challenge you to really have a deeper conversation, not just come in a meeting. Yeah, they want crime. They want to feel safe. And unfortunately, because we have conditioned our neighborhoods to feel like the police is the only thing they have to feel safe. I mean, I've gone into several community meetings when on one hand, they talk about the crime, they talk about how bad the police treat them. And then you say, what do I want you to do? Send more police. So you can't just use that to say this is what they want. That's not accurate. And that goes to say, how much time have you really spent talking with the community and really getting to know them? Because if so, when they say, I want you all to lock it down, it may be slightly different than what you think they mean. So that's all I will say on that one.
Can I chime in, please, Brian?
Yes, ma'am.
This is Keisha. And you and I have had this discussion before, because a lot of times, and it goes back to the original question of this meeting. You know, what is the definition of public safety? Because you do go into particular neighborhoods and they say that they want more cops, and that is what they're saying is, I want to feel safe. But for so long, the presence of having a cop there or the police, the way that the society is structured, is that's what makes them safe, is the police. And so that's what you're hearing. You're not hearing so much, I want more cops. It's, I want to feel safe in my community. And unfortunately, society has made it so that has equal to police. And what we are trying to do is redefine the definition of public safety. And that's what we're tasked to do, not reimagine the police, is reimagine public safety. And it comes with so many different
Can I just
that we have to take besides that. Go ahead, Ron.
I just want to ask a question because I said I was going to take up any space. So my question is, in reference to this concept of black on black crime and black on black healing, have you ever heard anyone refer to a school shooting in the suburbs, so-called suburbs, as white on white? Has anybody ever heard that statement, white on white, like when Columbine, any school, you never hear white on white. So this idea of black on black, I say it's a racist statement because it's based on the idea of, so folks who live together in proximity are going to act out based on an array of factors. When you go to Ireland, you don't hear people talking about white on white murder in England or Ireland, or Chinese on Chinese murder in China. So I think it's important to be careful and thoughtful and insightful and do some homework when you just say these phrases that have been perpetuated,
yes,
that are in a way, they're derogatory and dehumanizing, and they don't honor the dignity, let alone the respect. Respect, you know, like my students say, Dr. B, you have to earn respect. But every single human being is entitled to dignity. Dignity. And this idea of classifying Black people or labeling them as black on black crime, it just like neutralizes the whole idea of, so the poverty and the systemic and the structural racism that created again, this idea of the big six. All of this stuff is symptomatic of systemic structural racism. And I mean, like, there are countless studies, countless books, countless information on it. Part of breaking this down is dismantling some of this language of domination. Black on black, at risk, underserved, marginalized. That's all part of the oppression. That's all part of the systemic racism. That's all part of the structural racism. So, I mean, hopefully this idea of black on black can be, I mean, like, we can dismantle that just by not saying it and understanding the psychodynamics behind it. Amos Wilson said black on black violence in the service of white domination. This system is pervasive, pernicious, and we have to really break it down. We have to really understand it. We have to really understand it. Otherwise, this idea of reimagining public safety is not going to happen because we're still looking at it from a white perspective. And white perspective does not mean white people. Whiteness is a mentality. Frantz Fanon wrote Black Skin, White Masks. It's not about the individual. It's about the system that we have to, we have to acknowledge the impact of the system.
Okay, so I think we agree, quite frankly, I think you basically said the same thing I said, is that systemic racism got us to where we are. We created these big—
Brian, no, I did not say the same thing you said.
Okay, well, let me finish.
Okay.
And so what I'm saying is law enforcement or public safety has to look at what's going on in its community, and it has to individualize its strategic and tactical approach to whatever it's going to do. And when you see the violence that's going on in these communities right now, is appropriate to address those with the appropriate strategies, resources, and tactics to protect those people that are scared and are good people and they need to feel safe. And in the beginning of all this thing, when I discussed the redefinition of public safety, I said that it has to, the public safety historically has been law enforcement, but I feel now, and to some degree, some agencies and some cities have done this, we need to prioritize prevention, intervention, and enforcement as the last resort. And the approach to that should include a comprehensive collaborative relationship, not only with law enforcement, but include human services, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, and to bring those entities together in a strategic way to be able to address and create safety in our public. So
I would like to challenge everyone with the thought that we have been doing policing the same way for decades, right? The Big Six have had these same issues for decades. And so the idea that we're just going to keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result, I believe I heard somewhere that was insanity, right? And so to think that let's just lock it down like we did in the 80s, let's just lock it down like we did in the 90s, let's just lock it down like we did in the early 2000s, is going to be the same, that is going to give us a different result now moving forward. You know, I think I want to challenge us all to really think of how effective policing has been in the Big Six over the long haul. And also the fact that we don't necessarily have the data to back it up, right? This speaks to the systemic racism within the police department. So even if the lock it down worked, right? Even if it was beneficial to the Big Six, we all know that that's not the case. But we don't have any data to support it either way. And we don't have that data because the police department is racist.
So let me just
keep up. I'm not finished, Brian, and does not keep up with the details and the actual data of what has been going on for 30 plus years. So to run in and say, this is what works, this is how it happens, and this is what it is disingenuous. And I hear you, Brian, when you say that systemic racism is what got us here, but that same systemic racism has not stopped. It is what's moving us forward, right? We are still moving forward with systemic racism. And that's why the Big Six are deprived of economic access, a proper education, safe and affordable housing, employability. These issues stem from racism, systemic racism. And we continue to try to churn the wheel of racism as if we're going to get a different effect. It's racist. You remember back in the day, they said, it's the economy, stupid. It's racism. That's literally the problem, is racism. And until we eradicate that from every vestige of our community, it's going to continue to be the problem moving forward.
And we can't justify it by saying that's what the people asked for. That is not what they asked for. That's what you heard.
Okay, just let me clarify one thing. So I don't subscribe to locking anything down. That's not, I'm just relaying what they said. And that's not obviously what needs to be done. However, I will also clarify that they did become specific about setting up roadblocks, and they became very specific about what they wanted. So, but I'm saying what they said. I'm not saying what I subscribe to or agree with. So I just want to make that clear, that I wasn't suggesting that. So.
And Brian, I appreciate you being a part of this conversation. You definitely stepped up to have it, and so I don't want to. I'm not trying to attack or anything like that. I ain't trying to get ABF'd, right? But I also want to say that in these neighborhoods, the people in these neighborhoods have also lived a certain way for a long time, right?
Yes.
And so their answer to the problem, it's hard to see an answer that isn't there, right? If you've constantly had to live in this, okay, well, they're just going to ramp up policing now, and then, you know, we might be decent through the winter, but then the summer's going to come and they're just going to have to ramp up policing again, because that's the cycle that we see, right? And so if you're in that cycle, it's going to be hard to say, you know what, I want to try something different. How about we, how about you give me access to economic programs, right? How about my voucher can be used outside of this public housing unit, right? How about I can get employment and not be kicked out of my unit the next month because I now, go over the cap, and now have to figure out for myself how I can maintain and sustain my family over the long haul because I'm so used to this, right? There are other answers, but we don't use those answers because everybody's very comfortable sustaining racism.
Yeah.
Can I have a word?
Yes. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. From my perspective, at one basic level, public safety is about security. And that's something that every individual, every family wants. That they want to feel safe. They want to be able to enjoy some, whatever their quality of life as good as it can be. And that's an obligation that I think that everybody needs help with. Now, in terms of prejudice and discrimination, does it exist? Absolutely it exists. And there is no exclusive province for it. Lots of groups are discriminated against. There's been prejudice forever. I mean, we talk sometimes about, just real briefly, about where modern police departments came from. Well, a lot of it is based on what happened in New York City and Boston with the immigration of German and Irish immigrants, but that's beside the point. Now, on an individual level, even at a police officer level, and how people are treated in carrying out their duties, if there is a prejudice and racism that's built in it, or that is within the mind and body of a police officer, well, that's a problem, and that needs to be dealt with straight on. An awful lot of what I've heard this afternoon, and it's difficult sometimes because it does, I'm gonna be honest with you, it gets to be an echo chamber after a while. But the thing is that this institute, the systemic part of discrimination is extremely baked in. So I agree with and I'm sorry I missed the name, but yeah, I mean, like use of vouchers, for example, or economic opportunity, or being able to have extra income without being penalized for it. I mean, those are all super legitimate issues. The very existence and how the Big Six were put together, those were all enacted by law. And they've been that way for 70 years. So yeah, there's all kinds of frustration, and you want it to stop. You want it to be different, and I think that's legitimate. Yes. And I think that if there are broader awareness across all populations, I think that's helpful. But I'm telling you, you know, I can list off any number of things. Why is it that GRTC is owned 50% by Chesterfield County? And only just recently did they allow a fixed bus line to enter that county. You know, why? I mean, they used to tell you straight up, right? You know, we don't want crime in Chesterfield to go up. And that is absolutely BS. Absolutely BS. So even in what we think are more modern times, some of these attitudes may not necessarily be front of mind conscious, but it's become a practice and an acceptance and an acquiescence for so long. But it has to be changed at a policy level. And a lot of times that does mean legislatively. So I think these are really good conversations in that it does lift the awareness and provides greater drive to try to attack some of these problems. But I have a hard time sometimes where I feel like with all the systemic institutionalized racism that does exist, it's reflected in all of our laws. Heck, back in the late 30s, marijuana was made a Schedule I drug. And that was because J. Randolph Hearst wanted to discriminate against the Mexican workers working in California. And we still can't change that. So, but I do want to just express that sometimes what I'm hearing in these conversations is that all the frustration with all this institutionalized and systemic prejudice and discrimination is really being laid at the feet of the police, regardless of whether they're good, bad, they're enforcing laws. You know, if they're enforcing laws unequally, we got to deal with that. But it's very focused just on police and not on the people who really are in a position to make the change.
Thank you, Bill.
Well, thank you, everyone. This has been, you know, an incredibly engaged conversation today. And I just want to say we're, you know, almost 30 minutes over of our scheduled time. And so I just want to say thank you so much for, you know, staying engaged in this conversation and knowing that you all have now been on a 2.5 hour long Zoom meeting on a Friday. It just shows how important this is to every single one of you. And so I just want to say thank you. I think that we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of challenges that stem from racism in our community. And I think that we are all acknowledging that here, acknowledging that we have a role to play to try to right those historical wrongs so that we can create a better society, a better community for, you know, for Richmond. And I think part of that is the job that has been put before all of us to reimagine public safety. But as Natasha has said again and again over the course of this call, it doesn't begin or end with public safety or the police. We have a lot of other challenges ahead of us, whether it's housing, whether it's providing that economic empowerment, whether it's a livable, workable wages for folks, whether it's healthcare access, where we've seen glaring gaps in health disparities because of the pandemic that not only existed during the pandemic, but way prior, right? And so I think that I just want to say I appreciate all of you being part of this conversation, knowing how dedicated you all are to addressing these issues within our community. And I think, you know, the fact that we're, you know, when we all came together 45 plus days ago, a lot of us did not know each other. A lot of us had never had conversations with each other before. And I can say that I've personally learned so much from each and every one of you that I didn't know before. And I think that, I think Daryl and I talked a lot about this, that we didn't know where this was going to go when we first came together, but we're able to have these open and honest conversations with each other. And that's an amazing first step, and a step in the right direction for where we all need to go and what we need to continue to expand further than this task force. And so that is all to say, thank you. And we have a lot of work ahead of us and a lot of other issues out there that I think all of us can keep collectively advocating for change together, and we will get there. But just wanted to say thank you. And unless anyone else has anything else, I think we will end our meeting today and continue the work next week. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.